Father and son. Eumaeus slipped quietly out of the door, and in the same moment, the goddess Athene slipped in. She made herself visible to Odysseus alone and spoke in a voice that only he could hear. Odysseus, now is the time to reveal yourself. Tell your son everything. Tomorrow, go to the city and enter your palace, and remember, he as you always are, wise and bold. I will be close by. Before she left, the goddess touched the old beggar with her wand. At once his back straightened and his skin was made tight and smooth. His dim eyes brightened and his thin gray hair turned thick and black. In place of his rags, he wore a wreathed purple tunic once again. Telemachus looked up and paled. Stranger, you must be a god. I pray that you've come in friendly spirit. Telemachus, don't be afraid for me, for I'm no god. Come closer and see how alike we are. And so we should be. For my name is Odysseus, and you're my dear son. And with those words, he threw his arms around Telemachus and held him close. Great sobs welled up from both men, and the father's tears mingled with the son's as they ran freely down their faces. They stood back and examined each other. They laughed with joy to see how alike they were. They sat down before the fire, all thought of sleep forgotten, and started to tell each other about their lives. Odysseus told his son about the years in Troy and the story of his unlucky journey home. When he finally finished, the young prince had laughed and cried 100 times. In the early afternoon, they took a skin of wine and a basket of food and walked to a spot they both knew, high on the hillside above the swineherd's cottage. Sheltered among large rocks, they could look out across the island to the city, while Telemachus told his father of his childhood and his early youth and what had happened since the suitors came. Later, as the sun was going down behind the hills, they turned their minds to the present. Dear son, said Odysseus, listen well to what I have to say. The suitors are many and we are just two, but I promise you this, with our strength and guile and the help of Athene, we'll destroy them all. Tomorrow, go back to the palace. Say nothing about me, not even to your mother. I'll follow in my beggar's disguise. The suitors will abuse me. Say nothing. When it's time to strike, I'll tell you. Now, we must return to the cottage, for Eumaeus will be back soon. And one last thing. Whenever you're afraid, remember to trust in me. Dear Father, alone I was afraid, but now that you're here, I have the courage of 100 men. If Zeus and Athene are with us, then the suitors are surely doomed. The beggar comes to town. The suitors were worried. The young prince had outwitted them, and the queen had accused him of his attempted murder. They laughed off her accusations as the ravings of a troubled mind, but they were alarmed by the turn of events had taken. Now they sat uneasily in the great hall of the palace, pondering their next move. I'm all up for finding the boy and finishing the job off right, said Antinous. As long as he's alive, we'll never get our way. But we should choose our time carefully, says Eurymachus. We must make it look like an accident. There's no need to kill him in broad daylight. For the moment, let's just wait and see. The other suitors murmured their assent. There were a few, like Amphinomus, who felt that what they were doing was wrong. But they were powerless to oppose Antinous and Eurymachus. These two ruthless men had become the suitors' spokesmen and leaders. They basically ran the palace. After 3 years in Ithaca, most of the suitors had abandoned any ambitions to marry Penelope themselves and were content to enjoy themselves as privileged followers and hangers on. Hardly had they agreed to postpone his murder when Telemachus himself entered the hall. A hush fell over the suitors as they watched the young prince approach. His face was pale as death, and his voice trembled with anger and contempt. Is it such a shock, then, to see me back in my own house? Or were you expecting to see my ghost? My dear Telemachus, replied Eurymachus in honeyed tones, I can't tell you what a relief it is to see you again. We were afraid that you were lost on the high seas like your father. Telemachus, welcome home, said Antinous, stepping forward to place a hand on the young prince's shoulder. And now that you're back, let me offer you some fatherly advice. after all. I hope to be your father soon. Your lovely mother's been ill with worry since you went away. We've done everything in our power to comfort her, but she still fears the worst. Go to her. Ask her to forgive you for all the trouble you've caused. Telemachus angrily shook off the treacherous suitor's hand. He walked out of the hall without a word and climbed the stairs to Penelope's lonely room. He found his mother lying on her bed, weeping for her long lost husband and the bleak future that stared her in the face. When she saw her son, she leaped up and embraced him. It was a long time before either of them spoke. Then, when Penelope grew calm, they sat on the edge of her bed, and Telemachus told her about his journey. She questioned him closely, and he kept nothing back, except the most important news of all. He longed to tell her that Odysseus was already in Ithaca, less than 1 day's walk from the palace, but he had sworn to keep quiet. She would know soon enough. In fact, even now, as mother and son were talking, Odysseus stood outside the palace gates. He and Eumaeus had set out from the swineherd's cottage the same morning, and had already had a taste of what lay in store for them. Not far from the city, they had encountered Melanthius, the royal goatherd, driving a dozen of his best goats to the palace to please the greedy suitors. Melanthius considered the swineherd his rival and resented his loyalty to Odysseus. He himself had sided with the suitors from the start. Seeing Eumaeus in the company of a miserable beggar, the goatherd laughed out loud. Ha! Well, you two are well matched, I must say. I hope you're not taking your new friend to the palace, Eumaeus. The suitors don't care for mangy dogs. They treat them like this. And Melanthius kicked Odysseus hard in the side as he passed him. Odysseus winced and stumbled. His first impulse was to punish the arrogant goatherd there and then. Instead, like a real old beggar, he shrunk away from his attacker and stared at the ground. Eumaeus was white with fury. You might laugh now, Melanthius, and strut about like a suitor while your herds are steadily eaten away. But I promise you this, you'll dance to a different tune when Odysseus returns. Melanthius laughed even louder. You too, Eumaeus, you're like an old dog that's lost his master. Don't you understand? Odysseus will never come back now. Either he's 6 feet under in some unknown land or keeping company with the flat fish at the bottom of the sea. And a good thing, too, if you ask me. I like the suitors and they like me. The trouble with you is that you're stuck in your ways and too proud to make yourself useful. So while I sit among the lords and princes, you go around with a flea-ridden old beggar. Melanthius swaggered on ahead, while Odysseus bit his lip and watched him go. Eumaeus sighed and shook his head. The two men walked on in silence, each of them deep in thought. Before long, they entered the city, and soon the palace itself came into view. Odysseus stood before the palace gates and gazed in wonder at his home. On the outside, at least, nothing had changed. A soft whine caught his attention, and he looked down to see an ancient hunting dog that lay wheezing in the shade of a steaming dunghill beside the gates. The dog was half starved and covered in sores, but Odysseus could tell that it had once been a fine animal. It stared up at him, twitching its ears and feebly wagging its tail. Suddenly, in its ruined features, he recognized Argos, his favorite dog that he had raised himself from a tiny puppy all those years before. He knelt down and gently patted its head, forcing back the tears so that Eumaeus would not see. Come, old friend, said Eumaeus. The young prince has asked me to bring you to the palace. And here we are. Leave that poor creature and follow me, and I warn you, be prepared for some rough treatment. Like most cowards who hunt in packs, these precious suitors are cruel men. The swineherd led the way, through the gates, toward the great hall, and the old beggar hobbled close behind him. Neither of them looked back to see the old dog take its last breath, happy to die now that it had seen Odysseus again. Inside the great hall, Odysseus was shocked by the scene that met his eyes. Men lay around everywhere, gorging themselves on roasted meat and swilling back strong red wine. The air was full of raucous shouts and drunken laughter. Some of Penelope's maids sat with the men, giggling at the crude jokes and flirting openly. At the far end of the hall, set apart from the rest, Telemachus shared a table with a few trusted friends, ancient Hilarthes, Piarius, Medon the page, and Phemius the bard. The young prince called Eumaeus over while Odysseus, in his beggar's disguise, sat just inside the threshold and waited. Soon, Eumaeus returned with bread and meat from the young prince's table. Odysseus chewed his food slowly, considering his next move. Setting his meal aside, he stepped out of the shadows and moved among the suitors with an outstretched hand. Most of them ignored him, but Antinous jumped up angrily at his approach. Insolent swineherd, he hissed, turning to Eumaeus. How dare you bring a vermin infested creature like this into our midst? You complain often enough that we devour your young master's inheritance. Do you expect us to share it with this dirty old beggar? Get this rich out of here before I drag him out and throw him to the dogs.